A big welcome from Verlingue and our guest speakers this morning. You will see numbers of webinars and around various topics to do with cyber and cyber insurance. We want to make this one different. We want to make it more interesting and hopefully more meaningful. Hence the title, which is Managing the Cyber Risk and the Future, rather than looking back over what has happened and what insurers like to cover and what they don't like to cover and what a cyber policy is all about. So we want to make this a lot more meaningful because there have been a number of significant changes within the cyber insurance market, which is responding, after all, to the threat which is presented to its policyholders by the increasing sophistication and the increasing number and cost of cyber attacks. We don't want to concentrate too much today on actual cyber insurance per se, but more on the associated risk management and the services which are provided by insurers and specialists, and the effects of not having the right security to combat the growing threat. First of all, again, big thank you to our speakers today, both real experts in their relative fields of cyber loss prevention and response. The first speaker you'll hear from, Graham, is a specialist risk management consultant from CMI, who are Verlingue's partner in advising our clients on risk management generally for cyber and explaining to them in easy to understand terms the threats which are involved. After Graham, we have Chris McMurray, who's head of Cyber Europe at Travellers, who are one of our preferred insurance partners for underwriting cyber insurance. We have the relationship with Travellers for very simple reasons. One, they have many years' experience in writing cyber in the United States and also in Europe. So they've been at it long enough to understand the pitfalls and the short-term fixes and trends. They also excel, I think, in providing both additional risk management assistance for their policyholders pre-breach, and also a superb service if the worst happens and there is a cyber incident. So very pleased to have these two guys, both of whom I've known for a while, and hopefully you'll find what they have to say interesting and maybe a little eye-opening. And then before we wind up, just a closing note back from myself, maybe just to highlight some of the current issues which are affecting the cyber market, which are mainstream but seem to not get the recognition and the publicity and the awareness which they deserve. After that, we're going to do question and answers. If you have any questions throughout, just write them down and we'll deal with them all. At the end, we will respond to each and every one in due course after the webinar finishes. So, before we kick off with Graham and the specific risk management services, just a very, very quick summary of where we are with the cyber market. Cyber, as you know, is a relatively new risk compared with other types of insurance. Probably only been actively transacted in the UK for about the last 15 years or so. Therefore, it's evolved and had to evolve exponentially in that time, both in terms of insurers understanding the risk, getting the cover and pricing correct, and also dealing with a mini explosion of insurers who want to write cyber insurance now. Travellers obviously have been there and about from day one, as I said a few minutes ago. There's now something like 60 odd insurers, underwriters, managing general agents who are writing cyber in the UK. We do or we can deal with all of them. We prefer, as I said, to deal with our preferred partners who are tried and tested. So this evolution of cyber is progressing along nicely in a stable insurance market. Then the insurance market changes and hardens, maybe 4 years ago or so. And then about 2 years ago, following on, or as part of this, a real sea change occurred in the cyber market, cyber insurance market, driven solely, well, virtually solely by claims, the incidence and cost of claims, and the increasing sophistication of cyber criminals and threat actors. Insurers react as you would all expect when a market is hard and when they're making losses, in that they find they have to charge more. They want to scrutinise risks a bit more, and the capacity for them to write limits of cover tends to reduce. There's nothing new about that, and that applies to all classes of insurance. What's different about cyber, and is part of the evolution, was that the whole thing turned round from finding a correct price and a correct limit and correct terms to actually let's concentrate on the security, which wasn't as much to the fore before then, probably as it should have been with hindsight. And we've gone for a stage now where insurers have said in the past, well, you know, we want our policyholder to carry a higher excess, or we want to charge more because their security is not quite up to scratch. There's loopholes here. We may exclude this little bit of cover. And we've really had a complete turnaround now. And to put it quite bluntly, we're at a stage now where no security or non-adequate security equals no cover. So with the best will in the world and however well run and managed a business is, if its IT infrastructure is not protected, we will struggle, our clients and prospects and businesses generally will struggle to find cyber insurance. It's therefore quite an obvious logical step to then, as a broker, as a risk manager ourselves, to actually, how can we help clients? You know, and you know, searching for previously unheard of insurers and spreading our net wider and is not the answer. We have to find clients who have the intention, or we have to work with clients, I beg your pardon, who have accept that the security is maybe not up to scratch. And this isn't a criticism, by the way. This is not to say, oh, well, you know, they've sat there, businesses have sat there and done nothing about their IT security. Yes, they have. But they've still got businesses to run and budgets to adhere to. And, you know, the sophistication and the growing threat has overtaken them. And whilst they have security, it's probably fair to say that in a lot of cases, it's not actually kept pace with the threat that's evolved around them. So I say this isn't a case of neglect in any shape or form, but we have to take these clients with the security as is, and they're awake and alive now to the threat. They have programs in place. They have revisions in their security strategy. Their IT manager will possibly have an increased budget to look at. Our job is to help them achieve a state of security which is acceptable to underwriters. Alternatives to that if they can't manage exactly what underwriters require, and to then get them in a state where it's fit for market, where we can take it to the likes of Chris at Travellers and say, tell them this is what they have. This is their program for improvement, or they have improved it. This is the timeline. Now, please, can you look at this? And that's really the only way forward. To get to that stage, we're insurance brokers. We're not technicians in the sense of being able to security analyze and check out IT systems. We needed a strong partner in that who were solely dedicated to doing that, and that's where CMI and Graham come into things. This is an exclusive mutual partnership we have with them. There is a range of services which CMI will provide, some of which they charge for, some of which as part of our relationship with them are free of charge. And that's where we are now. Our solution to the problem, to the current cyber threat, being risk management, a preferred bank of insurers who understand and accept and appreciate the problems which businesses have in getting to security levels they like, and a three-way team between us to then hopefully get the client in a position whereby they can buy cyber insurance at an affordable cost, at correct limits, and securing themselves, leaving the insurance aside, that actually the threat to them, insurance or not, has diminished. So enough from me. That's the background to where we are today. I'd like to hand over to Graham, if we may. And there he is in all his glory.
Great stuff. Thank you, Dave.
And
let me share
over to Graham for his piece. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. And can somebody confirm we can see my screen? I had a little bit of technical glitch beforehand, but I think you can see that. So yeah, thanks for the intro, Dave. And yeah, I guess just appreciate being asked. I think the relationship we struck up between sort of CMI and Verlingue over the last 18 months, let's say, not a little bit longer, has been sort of a successful, productive one for both clients and both businesses. So thanks for the invite to join you today. I guess just for everybody's, I'm not going to tell you too much about CMI. We're the technology piece of this jigsaw, really. So what we do as a business is really we're there to provide the IT support, the IT services, and the sort of strategic input and guidance to our clients, whether that's in a fully outsourced mode for clients that don't have any internal IT function, or in a co-managed mode to sort of work alongside and assist where business do. We do either or. So that's what we are. Like I say, we're the technology piece of this jigsaw. My role specifically, title's client relationship director. So it's very much around the commercial client facing aspects of our business, and a key part of that for me and for us as a business is the advice and guidance that we provide. Yes, we keep the lights on. Yes, we have the service desk to respond to issues that when things aren't working, and yes, we do technology change projects. But a big part of what we do is that forward-looking advice, guidance, informing our clients around the technology, that the changes in technology really that that they need to consider, where it's relevant to their business, and ultimately making sure that the technology has a positive impact on your business. It's long gone are the days where technology was just something to send an email or two. They underpin the success of many organizations out there. So clearly, sort of within the landscape we've got at the moment, and for a number of years, the security aspect has been a big part of that sort of forward-looking guidance and what's changing. And that's really sort of a key part of why we do sessions like this with clients and partner organizations. So this deck is really sort of our Q4 update, and maybe just a sort of quick thing there. It's not a matter of if, but when. I think the key thing I would say here is, it's every single one of us on this sort of webinar. Our business is, if you haven't had an issue to date, it's extremely likely that you will have an issue at some point. I don't want anybody to walk away thinking, that we're not a target, we're too small, or we're not interested enough, or whatever reason it may be. We are all. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a large scale, high impact issue, but there will be issues. So I think that's the first thing, and just really to take us all away. It changes. The threats change, the landscape change, the tactics and the techniques that are used change, and the tools and the technology that we use to try and protect change. And that's a key part of what we do. But what needs to stay, I say fairly consistent, because these things evolve as well. But it's that approach and strategy that we all take in order to make sure we're protecting our businesses. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. The final sort of thing on this slide really is people. It really doesn't matter what technology you have in place. We've got the greatest firewalls, the greatest threat detection systems. People looking at a screen full of, wall full of screens, sorry, with red lights flashing as something's happening or starting to build. The most impactful thing you can do as a business is to educate your staff. Give them awareness around what they need to be thinking about. I always remember sort of, I used to have a slide in sort of this deck, a couple of years back, which was a picture of a gate over a pathway. And obviously the intention of the gate is to sort of limit people going through, and down the pathway. But the problem being either side of the gate was just, nothing. So people just walk around the gate. And that's a little bit like, the analogy with technology. It doesn't matter what protection you put in place. There are always ways around it, or loopholes or the likes, and people just go down the route of least resistance. So we need to educate our staff to make them aware of the risk of doing so, and that's the risk to the business, but increasingly the risk to themselves, either from the sort of cyber threats in their personal sort of environment, in their personal finances, but from as an employee of an organization. Organizations are having to take a much firmer stance on staff who aren't sort of conforming with policies, because they're needing to protect shareholders and their own risk management. So if you're not doing that, that's the first thing. I'd say a little bit of a silly side, but just to sort of put this into context a little bit. There's two sides of every coin. Now there's no doubt the technology that we use today and how that's evolved and how it continues to evolve is a huge advantage to us as a business. Just as going back in the Industrial Revolution, everything that happened there was, improved productivity, etc. But as back then, the consequence, the negative aspect of that was pollution. The negative aspect and the consequences of, being, connected in the way we are with multiple devices, lots more data, is cybercrime. So it's not going away. And that's the thing. It's a consequence of the positive aspects of the technology. This isn't intended to be loads of stats and stuff at you. These stats change. They change periodically. They change from depending on the source you're looking at. They change on the location, the geographic location that you're talking about. But it is a serious issue. We as a technology provider, you work with lots and lots of security vendors, and they all have their own surveys, etc. But the one thing I guess I would just draw your attention to is the stat in the bottom right of this slide, which is the phishing email. The vast majority of cyber issues start with some form of email-borne threat. Something that's coming into a user's inbox that's enticed them, tricked them into taking some action, clicking on a link or opening an attachment or something. Now, I'm really conscious when I say that just feels like that's news from 10 years ago. And I'm hoping for most of you on here that is news from 10 years ago, and you're so familiar with that. You would be, you probably would be surprised how often, even as we're talking to people at networking events, etc., how many people don't actually understand that, and the security awareness that they give to their staff isn't there. So again, just to reiterate, that's why making sure your staff are aware of the issues and have a well structured, consistent and reinforced training program is to you. So I guess just moving on to the landscape a little bit then. So what's actually happening at the moment? I've got a couple of slides here, and there's lots of ways of slicing and dicing this, but clearly the biggest change that we've seen over the last couple of years is the outcome, the change in our working practices as a result of the pandemic, without doubt. Now, yes, of course, more and more businesses are moving back to the workplace. And we've probably all got different opinions on how far back we'll go towards that. But the point is, we've all seen the benefits of remote working, the flexibility, and everything that's about. But we are now even more connected than we were before. We've got people working at home on personal broadband using, that don't have any firewall, protection beyond the basic sort of router firewall device that the local Vodafone or Virgin provide. So we've got the protection there. We may even have a situation where we've got people sharing Wi-Fi or using PCs from home, etc. So there's a lot of information, or sort of a lot of changes there that have really just driven us to be, as organisations, accessing data and our applications from an increasing amount of devices, not all of those devices being controlled by the organisation, and therefore having sight and management of those, and in some cases shared, etc. So that's really driven a hugely different approach from the cyber criminals in the last couple of years, and ultimately, as I'm sure Chris is going to come to, a flood, a step change in the claim volume and type of claims that we're seeing. I think the second point really then is around the regulatory standards, whether that's regulatory, whether it's compliance, whether that's your industry, governing bodies or so, actually trying to now make sure that we, from a data protection, that we're doing the right things. And that's not necessarily just from a sort of GDPR perspective around the data protection. That is around making sure that we're, we've got the security in place to make sure that we're not going to bring, the industry or, or the likes, or, there's just a lot of stuff coming on there. And that's one thing we're seeing a lot from our clients. We're seeing an increase in, I guess, due diligence process, being, that our clients are being put through from their own governing bodies that are then coming to us to say, okay, look, we need to make sure we conform with this, or can you answer these questions, etc. So we are seeing that, increase. The third thing really, we said, we're all becoming a lot more aware of the threat through events like this, just through press, just through the education that's happening. But I've been in the industry, well, getting on 30 years or so now, and I remember back in sort of my early days in my youth, as it were, it's not silly saying that, but is how quickly the technology industry moved. And that's why I love it so much. It's it's an exciting place to be. I'll tell you what, the last couple of years have far outstripped the pace of change. Again, probably driven in part by the pandemic, but the pace of change in how we use technology, how technology is adopting, and the threats. Now, the challenge we have in the industry from an IT perspective is that the cyber criminals, are always going to be a step ahead of us. Because inevitably, we're having to react to what they're doing. We can, to some degree, second guess what their next step may be, and occasionally we'll get lucky and we'll be ahead of them on that particular sort of tactic approach they take. But more often than not, we're always reacting to the new approach they've taken. And there therefore inevitably will be a period of time between their new approach and the industry and the technology and security vendors reacting to and putting in place, new updates or new technology approaches that actually help us protect against those. And that gap is where we what we call like a 0-day threat, if you've heard that analogy. But everything's moving so much quicker, and it really is just a game of cat and mouse. And then the last thing really is around, I touched on that a little bit around the sort of the second point, but it's that supply chain. You can, as an organisation, have done everything you possibly can do to make sure you're secure, you've educated your staff, you've ticked all the boxes, and you've got a well-rounded, robust security posture within your organization. But if you have a supplier or potentially a client that has some form of connection into your business for whatever reason that may be, then they are the weak chain. It's like having, I don't know, the analogy, you think of a house, maybe you make sure your doors are all locked and your windows might be all barred and you've got security cameras everywhere. But if you lend your key to your neighbour because you need them to feed the cat whilst you're away, and the neighbour just leaves their doors open and leaves the key on the hook by the front door, all your security is pointless because they were the weak point. Yeah, so just take that note. You need to be looking at what you're doing. So a couple of questions really is, what are you asking in your organizations? What are you asking of your supply chain, where you've got those connections? And anticipate, I imagine you're probably already being asked, but anticipate the questions you're going to be asked. And how are you going to react to those? Are you comfortable you've got the protections in place? That supply chain is probably one of the bigger areas of focus now for cyber criminals. And therefore, the due diligence and the focus that's being placed on organizations, not just about your own technology, but about the technology around your sphere of suppliers and clients. This really, it's a slide that sort of talks about in a slightly different way, but we talk, there's more devices, they're connected from different places, wider range of places, there's more data, and this ultimately is it gives us or gives the criminals more what we call attack surfaces, more things to go at, and that's that's the more opportunity, which is why there's more regular attacks. That's the cycle we're in, and whilst I'd like to say we're going to be able to break that, I think the reality is we're not going to break it. We might be able to disrupt it, but it's going to be there. It's going to be there continually. So, I'm sure Chris may touch on this a little bit in his presentation, but you've got to be thinking about the damage. And this isn't just about, okay, I can't get into my system, etc. You've got the reputational damage. You're probably going to have loss of revenue. You've got that whole business interruption piece. You might have fines from your compliance bodies. You might have clients that, that yes, you lose, hence loss of revenue, but actually come after you for compensation. So there's a lot of consequences. Some are cash financial, some are just reputational, which inevitably then does longer term, impact financially. So need you to take a rounded look at the risk management and the consequences when you're deciding what investment and what your strategy is to protect against the risks. This is just an example of, we work with SonicWall, a security vendor, many out there. This is one that we've chosen to work with. We've worked with them for a long time. We know them, we trust them, and they do a good job in the things that they do. They every 6 months update a trend. This is really just to show you how things are changing now. Interestingly, the ransomware attacks in the first 6 months of this year dropped. Now that happens occasionally. You may find in the latter 6 months it will pick up again, but I want to just draw your attention to the two on the right. These really are the sort of as you can see from the charts, IoT malware. Now, IoT is what, we're great in our industry for analogies, Internet of Things. What that is any, we're all increasingly having or seeing devices that are connected, to the internet. That could even be, your car, your fridge, your heating, etc. Now, think about that in a sort of a commercial organization. Every time you have one of those devices internet enabled, that's a route into your systems if that device is on the network, which is why the criminals have really gone, cyber criminals have really gone after that. And then the one on the right is what we call encrypted threats. There's technology, security that we as an industry have put in place that encrypts data. Now, the concept of encryption is the fact that if it's encrypted, you can't see it, you can't get it. Guess what? They found a way of getting at it and getting into it. And actually now they've turned it to their advantage in the fact that they can put threats into encrypted data. That now means the security software that's trying to look for those threats can't see it because it's encrypted. This is just the madness of what goes on. But the point from that is, you can't take a sort of a position where, okay, we did what we did with security and we've done that. Now we don't need to do anything else for 5 years or 3 years. It's got to be continually looked at because the the landscape's just continually changing. So how, what approach do you take? Really, it's around, NIST here is one of those frameworks that, and there's a couple of them around that, outline how to approach your security strategy. And this is where we hook back to the strategy. Yes, there's lots of tactical things you can do, lots of tools, lots of protection you can do, but you've really got to take that step back and take a rounded look at actually the strategy, the approach, the framework you're going to use. Now, this one in particular is really looking at, it's identifying, this is the risk management piece. What risk do you have? What data you have that's more risky? What's the demographic maybe, and the IT literacy of the staff working in your business? What's the industry you're working in? Just get that risk management profile of what you are as an organization. And then from that, you can define, okay, what's the appropriate protection to put in place? What steps do we take in order to protect against those risks and minimize those? Now, we all know in the risk management game, it's a very costly business to bring your risk down to zero. So we never do that typically, unless you've got a bottomless pit. We have to take that balance somewhere. So it's understanding what we do with protection. And then the detection piece is, okay, we've got the protection, but we can't just sit back and think nothing's going to happen, because for the reasons I just explained, things will happen. That protection becomes outdated, or the criminals found a way around that. So we need to find some way of actually proactively detecting there looks like there's something going on. Okay, and then when you see that, it's the response phase. Okay, what do we do? And yes, there's a technology aspect to that. What do we do? And some of that might be automated, but yes, it automatically locks down access for an IP trying to get into somewhere. So there's technology stuff that can happen there, but there's also your internal operational procedures. Who needs to be notified? What needs to happen? Do we need to be notifying clients? What's the communication process we need to get in place? So there's that whole response piece around a breach incident, which I know Chris will talk through in a little bit. And then there's the recover. That is, okay, well, look, if you've lost data or data has been encrypted, you need to make sure you can get back to that recover mode, so that you can actually restore your operations back to where it was. You can restore confidence for clients, etc., etc. And then the circle goes around. So that's really the framework. So I think I'd encourage you to start with that identify piece. If you haven't already done so, work with Verlingue around around that risk management. Understand what your risks are, and then we can move from there. So really, sort of last slide really is just some practical checklists. Now I know this session's recorded, etc., but if you want to just screen snippet or something, this isn't a completely exhaustive list of technologies that can be used, but it is the ones that we talk about in most situations that are most appropriate to most organizations. The ones on the left column would be the ones that I would sit there and say they are essential. You should have those in place as a minimum. The ones on the right, yes, we're always going to recommend you should have them. Again, it comes down to the risk management and how far you take things. But we've got things on the left, making sure you've got the right hardware in place, all the endpoint detection, whether that's antivirus or other more common or more modern technologies. Make sure you've got the right email security in place. The one thing just to pick up on there is, if you're using Microsoft email, which most of us are, I imagine, yes, they have some email threat detection systems in there. In our opinion, it's always good practice to have a secondary vendor. It's like sieving stones. You've got the primary sieve, but if you have a secondary sieve, then less stones are going to get through. It's almost that concept, really. The awareness training, and I touched on recover a moment ago, but do not forget your backup and disaster recovery, because that is one of the most powerful tools you'll have in the situation of an incident does occur. And then a couple of things on the right here. So again, an easy tip: Microsoft 365 security score. If you've got Microsoft 365, we work with our clients to use that security score to improve their posture and the likes. So have a snip through those. If you've got internal teams, etc., just ask the question. Ask CMI, ask Verlingue. We're more than happy to talk through that. My details are there. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anybody or answer any questions as we go through. And I just sort of wanted to finish there. I remember somebody telling me, something I've read or somebody told me, because you quite often see this, there's this thing called advanced security, and someone says, well, why does advanced security exist? And the answer is, well, because basic security isn't good enough. So it just tickled me at the time. So just want to leave you with that thought is, there's never too little you can do from a security perspective, in my personal opinion. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Chris now, and we'll talk about travellers and I guess the broader sort of underwriting market.
Thanks, Graham. And just as you hand over, there's a lot of points in there that certainly you've covered, that from an insurer's perspective that we certainly look for to be covered off when we are looking to underwrite any risk in particular. Just building upon Graham's points there, I want to take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour and the time that we have today, touching on the product, but also giving some real-life claims examples that we see, building on some of those threats out there, and basically how you can better protect your business from that ever-growing threat. So if we look at, first of all, the product itself, the product is essentially split into four main areas, which at Travellers, you have your third-party coverage, which is your liability. So this is your privacy and security liability, media liability, and your regulatory proceedings, which are covered in that box there. And then the other three buckets you see are your own first-party coverages. So breach response, which is an absolutely key coverage, because that's what you'll see essentially when things go wrong. And the vendors that you see dotted around the outside of the slide are some of those that we use for different functions within there, such as the privacy breach notification, your IT forensics, public relations, data restoration, etc., which all fall within that box. Cybercrime's an interesting one, because I think there's certainly been a tendency in recent years to discuss the likes of ransomware. And obviously that's one of the things that's been keeping cyber insurers awake at night. But we are seeing an ever-growing amount of cybercrime, social engineering, phishing, etc., which is now taking place. And it's taking place with an increase in volume, but also the increase in sophistication around it as well. So here we are picking up your computer fraud, funds transfer fraud, social engineering, vendor or client payment fraud, telecom fraud, etc., which all falls within there as well. And then finally within that, on the third party side, first party side, is your business interruption loss. Now, business interruption doesn't tend to stand alone in that with any of the sort of three buckets that I've mentioned previously. We do seem to see that there is a business interruption loss, which actually is a consequence of those. So here we're picking up things like your actual income loss, but as Graham touched upon there, other areas such as your reputational harm, the supply chain, your dependent business interruption, etc., which all form part of not being able to function as you would in a normal day-to-day basis, and really rolling that up within the package as a whole. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the product itself, which can be quite a dry topic, I realise. So I thought it was worthwhile trying to draw out a little bit what that actually looks like in practice by pulling out some of the examples that we see. So looking at the liability side, first of all, this is a fairly typical example for us where a hacker's obtained some sensitive information from the insurer's computer, and as a result, they basically have a number of customers who bring a claim against the insured for allowing them to access that personal information. Now, this is an interesting one for us because here what we're now starting to see is it's almost like PPI of its day, where we're seeing a lot of sort of ambulance chasing legal firms, for example, that when they hear of a breach, they're getting an advertisement out there trying to get customers to come forward who've potentially been affected. And the damages and the defence costs for that can actually be quite significant. So that's certainly a big challenge now, because, as I say, it's very high profile in terms of the nature of it. I mean, we obviously see a lot of high profile ones in the press out there, but even at SME and mid-market level, we are now starting to see a lot of activity in that area. And as I say, it's an area that costs can actually rack up very, very quickly. Moving on to the breach response. This is actually a good example here of a lot of the time where people think about the ransom payment, for example, as being the headline and the part that's going to actually cost you money. But in reality, in the experience of us, and I think probably most insurers, the costs that we actually see are accumulated in other areas. So for example, in this one, we had a fraudster who hacked into the insured's internal processing system. So things like names, addresses, national insurance numbers for more than 50,000 of the insured's customers all captured from the system. That required notification to all those 50,000 customers, which obviously there's a cost against there as well. But not just that cost to the impacted customers, again, you've got that reputational harm aspect to that there as well. So all these factors all factor into that breach response. And when we get into the breach response a little bit more detail later, you'll see how that's tailored depending on the exact incident. And then we pull in the appropriate vendors for the specific tasks that are needed at that time. Cybercrime, as I said, this is something that's very much been in the increase, not just for us, but I think for insurers across the board. And I think the alarming thing in this area is it's moved a long way from emails that were very easy to identify, you know, such as a foreign lottery win, for example, or a foreign print reaching out to you to transfer money, all that sort of thing. There really is now, in some ways, a grudging admiration in terms of the effort that goes into this area. And if you think about it in one way, I said this to a client the other day, when was the last time you really read about a bank robbery, for example? And that the theft now tends to all have a technological element to it, whether it be extorting a ransom payment or whether it be a social engineering fraud, phishing, and obviously the crime that actually comes from that. And the example I've put down here is a fairly typical one where we've an employee in the insured's accounts payable department who receives an email purportedly from an established vendor asking to change the vendor's bank details. The employee relies upon the fraudulent email and transferred 50,000 from the insured's bank account to the fraudster, which is only then discovered when the real vendor contacts the insurer requiring payment. Here we would reimburse the insured's funds, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of now. And again, over the summer, to Graham's point, we were one of the insurers who actually did see a bit of a downturn when it came to actual ransomware demands. And again, there's various schools of thoughts around that in terms of the impact of some of the threat actors maybe been otherwise engaged in the situation in Russia, Ukraine, etc. But during that honeymoon period, if you like, for ransomware, what we did see was the flip side, that cybercrime was very much on the increase. So almost as you're starting to see one exposure perhaps reduce, albeit I suspect momentarily, cybercrime was the one then was very fast growing and something that, again, for businesses of all shapes and sizes, they need to be aware of, because, again, building on one of Graham's points, you can have all the technology in the world in place to try and protect yourself, but the bulk of these losses tend to have a human error element attached to them, whether it be clicking on the email which lets the fraudster in the first place, or whether it's actually transferring the money without verifying the request, etc. And again, the problem you have is a lot of businesses, especially going through 2 years of a pandemic, are pretty much at the moment operating in a way that they might not have been operating 2 years ago in terms of resource. They may be quite challenging on that front. Obviously, the current economic circumstances may have put a bit of strain on terms of how much they can spend on training. They may have had to cut back on staff numbers, which in turn then puts more strain on the resource they have. And that all feeds into a culture of where people are busy or maybe don't quite know what to look out for. Then it potentially opens the door for such a loss then to actually take place. And then finally on the business loss and the business interruption side, again, fairly typical example of an insured's computer system being infected by a virus. And as a result, the insured's internal computer network is then taken down for an extended period of time. So again, I think there is always a thought process here of, well, you know, the ransom payment's going to be the part that's going to cost the money to get you back up and running there. But the reality is the payment to the insured for the lost income as a result of that disruption, and then all the expenses that go around that in terms of pulling together all the various vendors, from the IT forensics to anybody who needs to be notified, to any PR to manage the reputational loss, they tend to far out exceed any ransom payment that actually may need to be made because the ransom payment itself is probably more rare, I think, than most people would actually realise in terms of what it actually stacks up against opposed to the other costs. And then just coming on to some of the other threats and challenges that we have. So, we've covered off phishing there, ransomware. Some of the ones that we see quite frequently are a denial of service or a DDoS attack, which is essentially flooding your website with so much traffic it falls over and can't function. We do tend to see in the retail sector coming up to this time of year, where obviously it's one of their busiest times, a lot of opportunism in that area from threat actors, where they try and take down websites that way to try and extort payment to basically get that website back up and running as quickly as possible. So that's something that's certainly that's out there and needs to be monitored in that sense. Man in the middle attacks, again, kind of ties back into what we're saying on the cybercrime side of things, and it's a good example of sophistication and an area we're seeing a lot of growth. And this is where an attacker essentially positions themselves by making independent connections with the victims. Now, how they do this can be doing a bit of studying on the likes of LinkedIn, building up a profile, getting to know their target, and then basically being able to position themselves as a position of trust from there. And they basically then position themselves in the middle of their victims and relay messages between them to make them believe they're speaking directly to each other over a private connection, when in fact the entire conversation has been controlled by the attacker, just then waiting to strike. And then if we move on to what we actually do in the event of a breach, because again, cyber insurance is quite interesting in a way, and it's not like property or casualty where, a lot of it is focusing on the actual policy wording and what's within there. Whilst that's obviously very important, the part that you actually see is the breach response. That's the part that needs to kick into action urgently when something actually goes wrong. And I think particularly at the SME level, where there's potentially not that in-house IT expertise that they can rely upon, this is really where you will see a lot of value, because you've got access to these experts that you may not have should you not have a cyber policy in place. So given the time we have, a very quick overview, which is the first stage is obviously the discovery, which you would then be able to alert travellers 24/7, 365 days a year. You're then given a dedicated breach response expert who, in conjunction with our claims team, contact you to agree next steps and put in place the appropriate vendors, depending on the nature of the breach, in that engagement phase. Communication is something that happens throughout the process, so you're not left in the dark as to what goes on. There's direct and regular contact with that breach response manager to keep you informed of how the response is progressing, and then of course moving through to that resolution phase and getting you back up and running as quickly as possible. Now, having covered what happens when something goes wrong, to build on some of Graham's points from an insurer's perspective, the type of thing that we look for from a client to try and protect themselves from actually happening in the first place. Now, with travellers, multi-factor authentication is a key part of our underwriting process. Now, multi-factor authentication is the use of 2 or more authentication factors where MFA is successfully enabled when at least 2 of these categories of identification are required in order to successfully verify a user's identity prior to granting access. So something as a password or passphrase, something you have like a token, for example, and then you have your third part there, which is something you are, which is your biometric identification, etc. So when it comes to writing cyber from a traveller's perspective, if we see that the multi-factor authentication is not quite what we're after, then it's very difficult, back to the point that Dave made at the start, for us to actually consider that business for a traveller's cyber policy. But there are areas, which we can look at in terms of the overall security and getting that picture to try and build something there. But it's really to flag the importance of MFA and, why it's something that we really put on a pedestal within that security. So why is MFA critical? So stats suggest that 99.9% of account compromise attacks can be blocked by MFA, and 94% of the ransomware victims investigated didn't use MFA. And we've seen MFA as a tool that, since we started implementing that criteria within the book, has had a quite significant impact in terms of how the book actually runs, both from a profitability perspective for us, but also for keeping our clients safe and keeping them protected as well, where they actually implement what we would class as a full MFA solution. What should be protected with MFA? Well, again, it's looking at areas such as the remote network access, the privilege of admin access, and the remote access to email. So again, that's really what we mean by when we talk about that sort of full solution. We have instances where one part of that may be missing, and again, you're then starting to look at that as the whole security across the board, and we're going to touch on what we actually mean by that in just a second. And that leads us into, as I say, we've touched upon MFA, but the best risks for us, and again, Graham sort of alluded to this as he went through his part of the presentation, is we really look for an organisation that has multiple security layers. So to be slightly contradictory, as much as Travellers bang the drum about the importance of MFA, and it clearly is important, it's not a silver bullet that's going to protect you from everything that's potentially out there trying to get you. And the best security we see is when it's actually part of an overall layered program. So having in place such tools as antivirus, firewalls, email filtering and monitoring systems. If there is a dedicated security team, which again, when you start to get into maybe some of the smaller entities, that's perhaps not that realistic, but again, it's a nice to have. MFA we've touched upon. Building upon Graham's point too, with the security is obviously a very important part, but there is a large human element to this. And one of the things that we look for as an insurer is a regular phishing and cybersecurity training program. And what we mean by that is it's not something that when you start on day one, you complete a module and you never look at it again. We like to see a regular program which takes place throughout the year where, maybe a phishing exercise where an employee might click on a link, and that will report to you how many employees clicked on that. There'll be then training which comes off of that, but also making them aware of the evolving cyber threat, because again, it's not something that stands still. It's something that is constantly changing. So making sure that they are aware of the threats that are out there. And then also if something does go wrong, what they should actually do. So back to that breach response, that don't panic is probably the most important piece of advice I would say. But then going through the process, whether it be your business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, etc., and getting in touch with us as soon as possible to begin the process to get you back up on your feet. And then the final thing that we have on the list there is the endpoint defence response as well, just building upon some of the points that Graham made. So given the time we have, as I say, that's very much a whistle-stop tour from an insurer's perspective and the type of thing we're looking at. I'm going to hand you back to Dave now. Dave, I think you were collating any questions that anyone has, and hopefully we can answer those from there.
Thanks, Chris and Graham. Very informative. What more can I say? There you go. You've heard it from the experts. I think the important thing to bring from this is that clearly, if a client or a business is thinking of upgrading its IT, it's thinking of buying cyber insurance, it's best to involve the right people at the earliest stage. There's no two ways about this. I have examples where clients have spent a lot of money on beefing up, as they thought it, IT systems, tempered by the fact that they were also sales websites, retail online, and you end up with a compromise situation whereby neither really works particularly well. So the advice is out there. Please, please, please avail yourselves of it. Great, guys. Thank you so much for that. We are running slightly over. It doesn't surprise me. Cyber insurance and IT security is such a huge, huge subject. You can see on the slide in front of you there, I had some just closing remarks about current goings on. So I will really fly through these because these could be the subject of a whole new webinar should we want to make it so. Under insurance, when you buy cyber cover, you buy a limit of indemnity. That limit is fixed in your policy. If it doesn't bear any relationship to any accounting considerations or asset valuations, unlike many other types of insurance. It's a limit where you would feel comfortable that that is the maximum amount an insurer will pay. We are seeing, because of the costs associated with cyber incidents, that you should consider whether your limit is enough, and we're here to help clients and prospective clients with that. We have examples where cyber events have occurred where there's been an attempted intrusion. Data's not actually been stolen, but the process of the expertise which insurers make available to you under the breach response, forensic accounting, IT services, notification services to the ICO, and so it's like bills of into six figures very, very easily run up, where there's actually not even been any theft of data, any lockdown, any ransom. So you need to bear in mind that a cyber event can trigger lots of different sections of the policy, both the third party and the first party, as per Chris's examples there. Do please, we are finding more and more under insurance. There's no penalty. It's not like, you know, if you have £1 million sum insured, your claims, you know, £500,000, you'll be paid £500,000. No one's going to say, insurers are not going to turn around and say, oh, well, you should have had 2 million because, or there's no pro rata type of average condition as you get with other insurance types. But it is a maximum amount. It's an aggregate amount for all sections of the policy, and it's an aggregate amount in any year of insurance, 99% of the time anyway. So something to check. Silent cyber came to the fore about 3 years ago, and it's actually nothing to do with cyber insurance, but it's to do with the insurance cover which is available under your material damage policies, your fire policies, and your business interruption insurances, as a result of a cyber event. So a cyber policy will not cover physical damage. It's there to cover the risks which Chris outlined there, all of which are nebulous, non-tangible types of risk to do with data and information, of course. What can happen is that a cyber event, the classic example which is always quoted, occurred in Germany, where malicious hackers got into a system and they manipulated the system which controlled ovens to set these ovens on basically on a destruction course. By amending the working temperatures. The ovens exploded, they caused a catastrophic fire, which burned the place down. That type of loss now, depending on your policy wording, would not be covered by your fire policy. So it's not covered by cyber, it could be excluded under your fire policy. The silent cyber bit comes where, instigated by Lloyd's and Prudential at the time, where insurers were told to make it clear what cyber losses were being covered under material damage. It's a red flag. It's something which you should ask your broker, hopefully Verlingue, to just check. We do check anyway, but it's something which we would very much suggest to those of you who are not customers of ours. Bear in mind and have a check. Ask your broker. When is terrorism not terrorism? The answer is that it's an evolving threat which is now receiving attention from insurers, mostly as a result of state-sponsored terrorism and obviously associated with conflict in the Ukraine and the involvement of Russia. This is basically stems from the fact that in the past, a cyber policy would cover cyber terrorism in full. So as long as there's no physical harm, which is then the subject of terrorism insurance, as long as there's no physical harm, if it's a terrorist attack to disrupt a target's infrastructure and IT and data, then that is covered under cyber insurance. There's no exclusion. Insurers are now considering very, very long and hard where does terrorism actually stop and state-sponsored terrorism begin, where the hackers or the threat actors are actually sponsored by a government. And again, at this stage, it's evolving, but it's worthwhile having a chat, especially if your business is in a financial sector, and where its disruption could have a national effect. Air traffic control is one. That's probably an extreme example, but certainly anything which may involve a government contractor and similar. So again, something to just check. Future of ransomware extortion. There was alarming news, probably was it last year? 2021, where the French government were considering making payment by insurers of ransomware extortion amounts illegal, because they took the view that it was fueling criminal activity. It was an easy way for criminals to make money, albeit not out of the victim, but out of their insurance backer. It resulted in AXA, obviously a French insurer, immediately saying for their domestic policies, we will not pay this. We will not pay any more ransomware. It's not spread, but it is under consideration again, something which we need to keep our eye on, particularly in the US. They are issuing now strong advice in terms of payment of ransomware. Whilst they haven't outlawed it, we need to be aware. So 4 things to think about. Happy to go into those with more detail if any of you out there have any specific questions or concerns. And basically, that's it from me. And from our guest speakers. And if anyone, let me just check whether we do have any Q&As.
I think we had a couple of questions from Chris, but Chris actually has just reached out to them, maybe pick up after.
Right, okay. Fine. Thank you all once again for your time. Apologies, it's just slightly run over, but actually I don't make apologies because hopefully the content was such that it's all been meaningful anyway. So thanks again for your time. Great. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.